Thank you, Sandra. It's my pleasure to have this esteemed panel here of experts in the supply chain space who are really working on very tangible aspects of how blockchain technology and other technologies can be applied. So I'd love to just give each panelist a chance to introduce themselves and what perspective you're bringing to the panel topic.
Can I go first, Dale?
Go for it.
So I'm kind of in the weeds. I'm the data guy, interested in the elements of standardization for the data attributes for communication of interconnectivity and interoperability. Supply chain has a lot of stakeholders that don't necessarily know each other. We all know FedEx, and when we work with FedEx, they give us an identity, and we work with that identity to be able to process transactions inside of their platform, but across platforms, there's not really a standard, and that's the space that I work on in supply chain.
Thank you. Dale?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Dale Chrystie. I'm Business Fellow, Blockchain Web3 Strategist for FedEx. I've been in the space since 2017. I led the first first use case of blockchain at FedEx then, and have been focused in that space since then. I'm also chair of BIDA Standards Council, which merged with GBBC a few years ago. FedEx and UPS are founding members of that. We're focused on open, harmonized, and interoperable movement standards. And we each have different approaches to this conversation today. My approach, because we go to 220 countries and territories, we go everywhere in the world you can go, my default position is essentially at the International Space Station. And at that level, I would love to bring all of you up to that level and look at this, because it all starts connecting. It's one big kind of central nervous system from that point of view. And so we actually represent very interesting and very different pieces of supply chain, and yet they are all compatible. They all come together.
Thank you.
I'm Todd Ziegler. I'm the CEO of TCS Blockchain. TCS settled the world's first freight invoice on chain in 2022. Transportation is a $3 trillion industry in the US and Canada. I'd like to suggest it represents the largest B2B payments problem in the US and Canada. Most transportation companies are paid on net 30 to net 180 terms. Nobody can wait that long to get paid, so they have to sell their invoices, their receivables to third parties, to intermediaries, to factoring companies. They typically pay 30, 40, 50% annualized rates of interest to do that. Creates a silent tax on the supply chain that we all end up paying every time we go to the grocery store. So blockchain was the perfect place to build a solution to this problem. It really kind of is an old world fiat rail type of problem, but TCS has kind of been at the forefront, and we just recently announced a big partnership with PayPal and Paxos. And we're very excited to kind of be scaling in this new regulatory environment that's been initiated here on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think what's exciting is how the innovations in finance are kind of coming into this space as well, and we'll touch on that later. So supply chains are facing a lot of pressure from geopolitics, cyber risk, regulatory fragmentation, climate events, et cetera. What would you say from your various perspectives is currently the single greatest threat to global supply chain resilience today, and why is that? And maybe we'll start with you, Dale, to give us the broader view.
I'm going to go with the word you probably wouldn't anticipate. Again, she talked about political events, uncertainty. We just never know. At this point, what's the new normal? Well, it depends, today or tomorrow, whatever the case may be. My response would be the word fragmentation. We have thousands of years of history from a global trade point of view, and the previous gentleman, I appreciated his historical context. Again, this goes back to papyrus and paper and clay tablets and all that, but many of the documents that we have existed for a long time. FedEx is in a unique position, as are our competitors, UPS, DHL, and others, where we essentially have a calming effect on the resilience discussions, right, from that point of view. But a lot of that has to do with coordination, with the fact that these systems are so fragmented that one doesn't talk to the other. Or when you're moving something around the world, every time, every time he verifies something and he gives it to me, oh, hang on a second, let me verify this. Okay, oh, give it to Michael. Oh, what? Hang on, let me verify. We are doing that literally around the world. And so when these things happen, when political unrest, when all these things, could be a weather event, many examples of all this, our enemy is really that these are all fragmented systems. And the future of this is what we have to connect. We have to figure out digital foundations and digital rails that do much of what we've been talking about on stage this morning.
So Michael, is that ultimately a visibility and data integration problem?
I think, yeah, it's first seen in that space. It comes up that way, but it's kind of deeper than that. The entity identification and the human identification of who is updating a transaction. I mean, a transaction is as clean as possible when it's first planned. As soon as it starts moving, anything can take place with it, and then everybody is adjusting along the way to be able to try to be able to make that take place. But who makes the adjustments, where the expense comes in, where the delay comes in, is oftentimes pushed to your friend to the left or pushed to your friend to the right by the way that the paperwork is signed. And there's a level of accountability that each stakeholder has to take in the transaction that currently has gray areas that are kind of threat vectors of where bad actors have found a way to be able to come into those areas. So I think the biggest threat that's there is really knowing who your stakeholder partners are, knowing who your supply chain partners are, and verifying that information in real time to be able to protect against those ongoing threat vectors.
And from your perspective, what do you think is the threat that we're looking at today?
Yeah, I mean, other than things like, bioterrorism and things that could potentially impact food security in the country, I agree with Dale. We need more uniformity in supply chains. We need better rails for settlement. We need better rails and platforms and more uniformity in freight documents, things like bills of lading. I would argue, though, that one of the great keys to the success of supply chains in the United States is the fact that our system, and most people don't know this, 70% of all goods are on a truck at some point. Just about everything you saw and touched and consumed today was on a truck at some point. And the majority of the companies in the United States that are running full truckload, which is kind of the sector where I'm primarily based, are small businesses. Somewhere between 90 and 95% of trucking companies are 3 to 5 trucks. That shocks a lot of people because when we're on the major highways, we see the big carriers. But literally, these small businesses are not only the backbone to U.S. supply chains, but arguably the backbone to the entire U.S. economy. So in that sense, I think fragmentation is kind of a critical component of logistics. And I think that's one of the things that sets us apart from a lot of other jurisdictions that have more of a top-down, government-regulated way of managing supply chains. I think the fragmentation that we have as it relates to full truckload carriers and how this is, primarily managed by the private sector, I think that's really kind of the key to our success. And I think if we lost that, it would be catastrophic.
Well, so let's get deeper into like the trust and data visibility aspect of it. Everyone wants more visibility, but stakeholders, as you all have mentioned, operate across different systems, incentives, and levels of trust, right? You can't necessarily know everyone in the whole value chain. So even when we've got this technology that can help us share reliable data, it's still difficult. So trust remains a challenge, and global supply chains are very complex. So why is it still so difficult to establish this trusted data and visibility across multiple stakeholders?
So I think there's recent news that's just come out around this from the brokerage perspective. And if you work with a carrier directly, a shipper would tender a load directly to that carrier, and the carrier can perform the services of being able to move that. But if that primary carrier is not available, or they don't have a truck or a driver, oftentimes companies will go to a broker, and that broker has taken the responsibility of saying, well, I know a carrier, I can go get a carrier to be able to do this. And they had a waiver for liability for being able to do a background check or compliance check on that carrier's capabilities. The Supreme Court's just ruled that that's not the case anymore, that there's now a requirement for brokers to be able to do validation and verification of the carrier that they're putting forward to be able to move that specific shipment. But the requirement has changed the whole way that the whole industry brokerage works. C.H. Robinson in the past 2 weeks has made the change to be able to reduce their overall carrier number by 70%. The carriers that were in the bottom 2/3 or 3/4 of their overall carriers have gotten a letter to say, we're not doing business with you anymore. And the small carriers that Todd was referring to, that's what makes up our economy, is those small carriers going to brokers and those brokers finding loads to be able to fill them. So,
And they're getting rid of of that to reduce the verification
they have liability.
burden?
They have liability that they didn't have before, and they don't know how to be able to address it from an insurability perspective, so they're just washing their hands of it and saying, we won't deal with carriers that don't meet these certain compliance elements. It's a big change.
Yeah,
A really big change.
and so what do you foresee will be the impact of it?
A tightening of, well, actually, what I think is going to happen is that there will be a framework that is a risk analysis framework for compliance, where there'll be product-specific elements and value-specific thresholds, where there'll be like an insurance grid of, I have this type of product with this amount. And in some industries that exists currently, but I mean, go back to ICC days when, before deregulation, pricing for each product was done from each lane to each lane. I don't think we're going to get back to that level of granular control, but if you look at the systems like MOTIS that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has just released, they're trying to take all of those government systems that are the regulatory bodies and the verification tools and put them into one tool so that they can get some level of consistency for that background check. But that's just half of the equation. That's the government view of what the company has, not what their industry thinks of them or what their reputational score is. So it's to be determined. It's really a
It's
very
still very
dynamic
new.
time of what's happening in the transportation industry.
What about your thoughts on why it's still so difficult to have data visibility across multiple stakeholders?
Yeah, and Michael just brought up some really kind of important. The Supreme Court decision was huge, basically imposing a duty of ordinary care on brokers. That's a new development. There's also a massive amount of payments fraud in the system right now. I shared earlier the transportation industry, U.S. and Canada, is about $3 trillion. Full truckload represents about half of the transportation industry. And there's $1 billion fraud payments problem every year in the U.S. and Canada. And a lot of it kind of correlates directly with what Michael was talking about. It's a problem called double brokerage, where you'll have a broker, you have a broker in between two good actors, and they take the load from the shipper. They then tender the opportunity to go pick up and deliver the load to the underlying carrier, who's a good party. Maybe it's a one truck owner operator or a small business. And then when the shipper pays the intermediary doesn't pay the carrier who actually did the work. It's a massive problem that we have. And, I will argue that, blockchain isn't a perfect solution to it. But when all of these transactions are taking place in traditional finance on banking rails, you don't have a lot of KYC AML. You don't have a way to kind of isolate the bad actor and say, okay, how did we pay you? Where did we pay you? Where did the money go after we paid you? On blockchains, we don't have that problem. Now, my company is not at the scale of FedEx or C.H. Robinson or a lot of other companies, but we haven't had one payments fraud problem, right? Because all of our transactions are on chain. First of all, it's very difficult for those carriers for bad actors to even get access to the system, because they have to go through a level of KYC AML with us. They have to go through a level of KYC AML with the centralized exchange that they're utilizing for settlement. So it's very difficult for bad actors to get into the system. And, I love, we typically see the commentary from a certain sect of lawmakers on Capitol Hill talking about this, massive problem of illicit finance that we have in digital assets and blockchain. I think it's like, 0.01%, of all illicit finance happens on blockchain rails. Blockchain is not the place where you want to be if you're involved in nefarious activity, right? The majority of illicit finance happens, in USD in the form of cash transactions. So I think that there's kind of a larger role that blockchain and digital assets will play as the industry matures and as supply chains and blockchains continue to converge around this fraud payments problem. And, trust is always a huge issue. It's a huge issue in every industry and every sector. But I do think when we can deploy better technologies, better tech stacks, better solutions, we can improve the trust among counterparties.
Dale, did you have any thoughts?
I do. Trust is an interesting word, right? What does it mean? What does it look like? In the eye of the beholder, is it 2 + 2 = 4? Is there some way to define those kinds of things? And again, historically, we go back to, a canoe taking a tapestry across a river and sitting between supply and demand. And that proxy of trust is several thousand years old. I mean, maybe older than that, but we'll go back that far. And since then, it's only continued to grow. So now it may take a couple of dozen documents to get a shipment around the world. We handle, 18 or 20 million shipments a day. And there's, some massive magnitude when you start adding everybody else, the case may be. But paper was never the system. It was just a workaround for the system because we didn't have the ability to trust. Because when Michael can say, and we are at that point now, and we are very going to quickly see this, when Michael can say, I am who I say I am, right? He can say the same thing. They ship back and forth once a month from somewhere outside the U.S. to the U.S. We might be the carrier from that point of view, but U.S. Customs now, their whole model, think of social distancing in a model where you've got a bunch of agents all looking at boxes and checking things out. It falls apart. But they have the access to the same thing that we do with the analytics and the optimization. And once you can prove that Michael is who he says he is, and we know that those patterns, we can determine who they are, then don't slow that shipment down. Let it cross the border at the speed of data. Let it clear essentially before it actually gets in across that border. And U.S. Customs is working on that. Their 21st century framework, they're working on verifiable credentials. But the key to trust, again, I'll go back up to my view level, is we've got to connect these dots. But I also think we've got probably several thousand data points about every shipment that's moving in the system. You don't care about which conveyor it went across. You don't care about most of it. But I would argue that there's a handful of kind of authoritative facts about every shipment that I think we can and should, and we are leaning into this, identify and lead a cross-industry working group to establish some of these things. But it's essentially identity. So Michael is who he says he is. Ownership. He owned it until he owned it. It successfully crossed a border or cleared customs. And there's maybe a couple of others as well. You don't need the thousands of data points. I can keep that within my system. They can keep that. We don't need to put that on a blockchain. We don't need to get it out there from that point of view. But we do need to establish, he has now asserted that he is the owner, that he created this, whatever the case may be. And then, I don't know, maybe a notarization process to be able to say, look, has anything changed since he asserted that? No, keep it moving. And by itself, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but if you can identify a shipment at that level of only a handful of things, and it may or may not need to be on a blockchain, we can figure that out. There's lots of smart people in this space. But once we start establishing that, we can now really go away from this every time somebody touches it. Oh, hang on, I know Michael just verified, but let me verify it as, and that's what we've been built. The system, again, the system has really been the workaround. The future is digital. The future of global supply chains is digital. We need to create these common digital rails for everyone. This is not a FedEx commercial. We speak on behalf of everyone, large and small. It has to be a commons approach. It has to work for everyone.
I just want to add real quickly, it's, the bill of lading's been around since 1400s. I mean, it's been around for a long time to be able to document what I'm saying I'm putting on that ship to go across the ocean. There has been tremendous effort to be able to have electronic bills of lading. And the elements or the problems with electronic bills of lading is that they developed very similar to how other technologies came into this space. They each said, ooh, I want to own the whole industry and I'm going to be the e-bill of lading provider. I'm going to do it like this. And you got 10 different companies that make e-bill of ladings that are not interoperable.
Yeah.
And we've had 15 years of that effort, and now there's first reports of there being some interoperability between the electronic bill of lading providers, but it's just beginning of them agreeing to what are the data elements that need to be transmitted, whether it's in this platform or in this platform or in this platform. And what you end up with more often than not is that your customer may have bought that platform, which complies to a standard and to a regulation and to a rule, and I bought this platform, which complies to a standard and to a regulation and to a rule, but the two platforms aren't interoperable with each other because they haven't adopted standards. That was the topic of the last discussion of how do we get to the point that there's an understanding of what the standards are, and standards are not by themselves enforceable. They are voluntary. And industry makes the rules around how to be able to, have compliance penalties if you, for instance, of the barcode, don't put the barcode 2 inches up and 2 inches over from the bottom left corner that's going into Walmart. They ding you per box for being able to not be in compliance. That sort of incentive alignment is what's going to drive this towards a digital economy, towards a digital transaction to take place. And that bill of lading oftentimes has a lot of information on it that you don't want other people to be able to see. It's just for the three of us to be able to deal with, but when that goes to a factor and to an insurance company and to an underwriter and somebody, that's all exposure, and any hourly employee that's sitting inside of that organization is looking at that piece of paper knowing that they've got other jobs and other people that they have relationships with.
So there's a lot that's also being, figured out and debated in the financial services industry with KYC or privacy, using zero knowledge proofs or other sorts of technologies that is completely applicable, verifiable credentials,
Could be,
yes.
but it would require this industry to be able to say, we want to be compliant to those sort of rails. And I think the biggest issue at the moment is that people are accustomed to being able to have their receivables for 45 days and not have to pay their carrier that already moved it. And the promise of being able to settle that today is not exciting.
They're not interested.
That's not a value proposition. That's going to hurt my cash flow on every load that I move. And that's where there's a gap. I don't know if our government can step in from a perspective of their stablecoin side to be able to try to shrink that, but you get all sorts of inflation in those costs that are built because people are trying to be able to figure out how am I going to float this cash for 45 days until I get paid.
Yeah, well, let's
deal with that, right, Todd?
Yeah, and it's a really interesting point that you make. I came from the transportation industry to blockchain, and I owned freight brokerages, and FEMA and GSA were two of our customers, right? And if you're working with FEMA and GSA, they'll pay everything within Net 21, and you cannot have any factors involved in the settlement chain at all, right? Now, whether or not that ever gets imposed on the industry is a completely different question, but I can tell you I've been customer facing with Fortune 50 shippers who pay their carriers on Net 180. That's a profit opportunity for them, right? They're able to improve their balance sheet because they're effectively getting free financing from the carriers through the factoring companies. But the larger issue that's missed, and it was the issue that TCS was predicated on, is, well, that may be true. As a Fortune 50, Fortune 1000 shipper, you may be able to, source freight onto your routing guide cheaper than, smaller companies. But ultimately, consumers and small businesses are absorbing that cost. And that is a real solution that blockchain can solve for supply chains.
So we've touched on a lot of the challenges and what isn't working and how hard it is to implement some of these changes for resilience in supply chains. I want to hear a little bit more. Then let's transition into what do you think then, given all this, what's one change or several changes that you're looking for that you think would make the biggest difference in resilience in global supply chains? Anyone?
I'll start with that, and I realize I'm a bit of a one-trick pony up here, but part of my thesis has always been You know, and a couple of the panelists talked on it earlier. It can't be a solution looking for a problem, right? So there has to be a value proposition to bring transportation companies, to bring the industry on chain. Our thesis at TCS has always been that's about faster and cheaper payments, right? We get carriers settled in the same business day or the next business day. Now, a factoring company will do that too, right? But they're going to charge you 30, 40, 50% annualized to exit that instrument in 1 to 2 business days. And if you think about that from a trade finance perspective, I could have a Walmart receivable that's AAA rated, right? And I'm paying a 30% annualized interest rate because I can't wait 60 to 90 days to get paid directly by Walmart. So that's a real problem. But I do think that once carriers come on chain, right, things like uniform bills of lading, things like FMCSA registrations, I think it's going to be a lot easier for people to adopt blockchain and digital asset technology because they've already done something, right? We have a multitude of carriers who have come to work with TCS who knew nothing about crypto, digital assets, centralized exchanges, blockchain. And what I tell them is, look, settle one invoice with us. And if you don't like faster and cheaper and better, you can literally walk away. We won't, unlike a factoring company, we won't lock you into a contract that you can't get out of, right? And not one of them is left. So once they come, they'll stay if the value propositions are there. But I do think, again, as kind of blockchain and supply chain continues to converge, I do think that we can get larger participation from the industry on standards and commercial documents and things of that nature.
But people kind of need to sort of tangibly see how it works.
There's got to be a reason to dip your toes in the pool, right? Yeah.
I would just touch on Todd's point that it's about uncertainty. It's not that they can't afford to wait the 30 days for it. It's the fact that it's uncertain if it's going to be 30 days or 45 days or 60 days for it to be able to come, or it's certain that I'm going to get 97% of my overall receivable tomorrow, and I don't have to track it anymore. I don't have to chase it down anymore. It's just the one piece that I would add on what Todd was saying is the fact that it's a management decision to be able to factor those receivables oftentimes, and that management decision costs them on every single load because you can't just factor occasionally. You have to turn over all your receivables to a factor typically.
Unless you're with TCS.
Right, that's the difference.
So I know you're involved a lot in standards efforts, and that's a passion of yours. Is that the one thing that you're looking to change, to improve?
So it is. From my perspective, all these different systems that have matured over time with their customers where they walked in and said, I'll build you exactly what you want, use the exact terms that you have, they are all trying to be able to standardize the same data inside of their system and say, if you just use my system, you'll be able to do this with everything. But the systems need to be interconnected and interoperable, and for that to happen, we don't need to agree on every one of the 2,500 data fields that Dale collects on a FedEx movement, but we do need to agree on those 5 data fields that are on every bill of lading. The first time and date that it's available to be able to move, the origin location of where it's starting from, the destination where it's going to, who owns the transaction, and what's the reference number that's going to get it paid. And those 5 attributes have been written into a standard with ISO. It's called ISO 800119. It's the transport unit identifier, and it connects with the common steps of the goods movement process from posted to pre-booked to booked to en route to delivered to invoiced to archived. And we believe that with those common terms to be able to define the milestone steps that happen in a transaction, whether it's a FedEx system or a UPS system or a DHL system or an edge logistics system, it doesn't make a difference. They all have those data points, and formatting them into a standardized, readable way makes it so that the interconnectivity between trading partners can start with the minimal amount of pieces of data, and then the additional source of information can be verified from where Dale said, we store our own data. You can go to the source and go get it from Dale if he's moving that transaction.
So the standard is there. You just got to now bring everyone to your TUID party, right?
Yeah, and it's not my TUID party because everybody already has a TUID. They just need to understand how to be able to produce the recipe to be able to make the number and generate the QR code. And that's just training and learning. And I don't think it's too high of a bridge to be able to go over, and something that can be done internally inside of existing shippers and carriers and third-party logistics providers.
Great. And Dale? What's the change you're looking for that will really make a difference?
I recognize that we're in a really unique position. I mean, 220 countries and territories, not many entities get to view at that, and yet that's exactly where I'd want to bring you up to that view and look at that and see that this is all connected already. It's not a series of documents. It's all, it's kind of the central nervous system of global commerce. It's already there. And so while we each have different challenges, I think we agree on everything that we've said here. Our journey, our challenge as essentially global stewards is to help shape that broader discussion, is to work with those that we can work with, whether that's US Customs or others, EU Customs, competitors, and help drive that. I mean, the standards entities have grown up over the last 60 to 150 years, and there's about 18 or so of them that drive that, World Customs and IATA and all the ones that you would recognize, and yet they were all designed to do exactly what they've done. It's a bunch of silos, basically, that are somewhat industry-based. My wish list, if you gave me a magic wand and I waved it over that, it would be to bring them up to that view and say, look, what you've done is fantastic. It's excellent. It's gotten us to where we are right now, and yet tomorrow, what we're here talking about today, tomorrow is at this global level. Let's find a way not to do away with what you've done, not one thing of that, but to connect these over, to create this whole umbrella and say, look, how can we connect these into these digital foundational rails moving forward? That includes standards, that includes the other types of things that will do that. But we can't knock on every door in the world and make that happen. We have to jump above that and say, it's already moving in this way. Let's build these rails to reduce friction, the trillions of dollars of friction right now. And that's my magic wand, and now I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, well, hopefully some of those changes will come to fruition in the next few years. I wanted to highlight to the audience that we have this week released the new use case handbook. Please make sure you grab one on the table outside. So it's brand new, fresh, hot off the press. And some of the examples that were discussed amongst our panelists today are included in that handbook if you're looking for some tangible examples in the supply chain space of what's being done in the GBBC community. Thank you so much to my panelists. It's been a pleasure.